The building manager's hands shook as he handed me the dusty package. "Found this under the stairs, addressed to your grandmother." I opened it slowly and dozens of old photographs scattered across the floor. But when I saw what was in them, everyone in the room rushed to the window, staring down at the police cars that had suddenly surrounded our building. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My grandmother Margaret was 73 years old, but if you asked anyone in our building, they'd tell you she had the spirit of someone half her age. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for new neighbors before they'd even finished unpacking their boxes. Her apartment door on the 4th floor was like a beacon of warmth in our sometimes cold city. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla would drift down the hallway every Sunday morning, and kids would mysteriously appear at her doorstep, knowing Mrs. Mitchell always had fresh snickerdoodles cooling on the counter. I remember visiting her just 3 days before everything changed. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, the one with the faded blue flowers that my grandfather had bought her 40 years ago. Her fingers moved gracefully with her knitting needles, creating what must have been her 100th scarf for the homeless shelter downtown. "Jamie," she said to me, not looking up from her work, "did you know that Mr. Harrison has been asking about you children a lot lately? Such a nice man, always checking if I need anything." If only we had known then what that really meant. Margaret Mitchell wasn't just any grandmother. She was the woman who had held our entire family together through impossible times. When my grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack 35 years ago, she was left with 4 children under the age of 12 and a mountain of medical debt. Most people would have crumbled. Not Margaret. She took a job at the local diner working nights, then cleaned offices during the early morning hours. She'd come home just in time to make breakfast, braid my mother's hair, and walk all 4 kids to school. "Your grandmother never missed a single parent-teacher conference," my mother Linda would tell us, her eyes always getting misty. "I don't know when she slept. She just loved us too much to let us down." The sacrifices Margaret made were legendary in our family. She went without new clothes for 15 years so her children could have proper school uniforms. She learned to fix everything herself because calling a repairman meant less money for college funds. When my uncle needed braces, she took a 3rd job wrapping gifts at the department store during Christmas season. Her hands would crack and bleed from the constant paper cuts, but she'd hide them under cheerful red gloves she knitted herself. Even now, in her 70s, she refused to slow down. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she volunteered at the community center, teaching young mothers how to stretch a food budget and make healthy meals from inexpensive ingredients. She knew every child in the building by name, remembered every birthday, and somehow always knew when someone was having a hard day and needed a cup of her special tea and a listening ear. Her apartment, 4B, was more than just a home. It was where she'd raised her children, where she'd nursed my grandfather through his final days, where she'd hosted 40 Thanksgiving dinners and countless birthday parties. The walls held the memories of first steps, graduation celebrations, and wedding preparations. That tiny 2-bedroom apartment with its creaky floors and windows that stuck in the summer was the heart of everything we were as a family. Margaret Mitchell deserved peace. She deserved respect. She deserved to live out her golden years in the home she'd paid rent on faithfully for 35 years, never once being late despite everything life had thrown at her. She deserved so much better than what was about to happen to her. Margaret's days followed a rhythm as comforting as a favorite song. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, you could find her at her kitchen window, carefully tending to the herb garden she'd created on the fire escape. She'd converted old coffee cans into planters, painting them bright colors and filling them with basil, rosemary, and thyme. The classical music from her old radio would drift through the open window, usually Mozart or Bach, mixing with the sounds of the waking city below. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," she'd call down to her neighbor on the 3rd floor who always did Tai Chi on her balcony. "Your roses are looking beautiful today." By 8:30, Margaret would be dressed in one of her neat cardigans and sensible shoes, ready for whatever the day might bring. Mondays meant grocery shopping at Morton's Market, where she'd worked out a system with the owner over the years. She'd help him organize the produce section in exchange for the bruised fruits and vegetables that couldn't be sold but were perfectly fine for her homemade preserves and soups. Your grandmother could make a feast from what others threw away, old Mr. Morton told me once, but she never took charity, always insisted on earning everything. Tuesdays and Thursdays were her volunteer days at the community center. She'd catch the number 47 bus at 9 sharp, her worn leather purse containing homemade sandwiches for lunch and her knitting bag filled with current projects. The younger women at the center adored her. Margaret taught them more than just how to knit scarves and baby blankets. She taught them patience, resilience, and the art of finding joy in simple things. Mrs. Mitchell showed me how to turn my son's old t-shirts into a quilt, one young mother, Teresa, told me. But really, she taught me that being poor didn't mean we couldn't have beautiful things. We just had to create them, ourselves. Wednesday mornings were reserved for what Margaret called her coffee club. 3 other widows from the building would gather in her living room, where she'd serve her famous coffee cake, and they'd solve all the world's problems over steaming cups of Folgers. They'd been meeting for 15 years, ever since Mrs. Patterson lost her husband. The laughter that came from apartment 4B during those mornings could lift the spirits of anyone passing by. But Sundays were the crown jewel of Margaret's week. By noon, her small apartment would transform into command central for family dinner. The old dining table, bought at a garage sale and refinished by her own hands, would be extended with a piece of plywood she kept behind the couch. Mismatched chairs would appear from every corner, and somehow, miraculously, there was always room for everyone. The smell of her pot roast would fill the entire 4th floor. She'd started at dawn, the meat slow cooking with potatoes, carrots, and onions in a sauce that no one could quite replicate, despite her openly sharing the recipe. My cousin Michael would arrive first, usually around 2 o'clock, claiming he was there to help, but really just to sneak tastes from the kitchen. Then would come my mother Linda with her famous green bean casserole, followed by Uncle Robert with his family, and finally my Aunt Susan with her twins. The apartment would burst with life. Children would play in the bedroom while adults squeezed around the table, sharing stories of their week. Margaret would sit at the head of the table, her face glowing with the kind of contentment that money could never buy. She'd make sure everyone ate seconds, secretly wrapping leftovers for whoever she thought needed them most that week. Recently, she'd started a new tradition with my daughter Sarah, her youngest great-grandchild. Every Sunday after dinner, while the adults cleaned up, Margaret would take Sarah into the kitchen for secret grandmother lessons. They'd make apple pie from scratch, Margaret's weathered hands guiding Sarah's small ones as they rolled out dough. "The secret ingredient is love," Margaret would whisper, winking at Sarah, "and just a tiny pinch of cardamom, but don't tell anyone about the cardamom." This was Margaret's world, simple, beautiful, and built entirely on love and hard work. It was a life that had taken her 73 years to perfect, a carefully tended garden of relationships and routines that gave meaning to every single day. We thought it would last forever. We thought she was safe. It started 3 weeks before we found that package. Such a small thing at first, something anyone else might have ignored. Margaret had come home from the community center later than usual that Thursday evening. Her knitting class had run long because she was helping Teresa finish a blanket for her new baby. The hallway light on the 4th floor was flickering again, casting strange shadows as she approached her door. She inserted her key into the lock, the same key she'd used for 35 years, worn smooth in places from decades of coming home. But this time, it didn't turn smoothly. The lock stuck, just for a moment, requiring an extra jiggle and a bit more pressure than usual. "That's odd," she muttered to herself, finally getting the door open. Inside, everything appeared normal. Her African violets sat on the windowsill exactly where she'd left them. The Afghan she'd been working on was still draped over her chair. Her morning coffee cup sat washed and dried on the dish rack. But something felt different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the air seemed disturbed somehow, like someone had been walking through her space. The next morning, Mr. Harrison was in the hallway when she left for her Friday errands. This itself wasn't unusual. He was the building manager after all. But instead of his typical brief nod and morning greeting, he seemed eager to chat. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell. How are you feeling today? That's quite a heavy bag you're carrying there." Margaret smiled politely, adjusting her purse strap. "Oh, this old thing. I've been carrying bags like this since before you were born, Mr. Harrison. Still, let me help you to the elevator at least." He reached for her bag, something he'd never done in the 15 years he'd managed the building. "That's very kind, but I'm perfectly capable," Margaret said, a slight edge creeping into her usually warm voice. Mr. Harrison's smile seemed to tighten. Of course. You know, Mrs. Mitchell, I've been meaning to ask about your family. How's Linda doing? And Robert? Still working at that accounting firm?" The questions continued as they waited for the elevator. Where did her grandchildren live now? Did family visit often? Was she finding the stairs difficult these days? Each question seemed caring on the surface, but there was something underneath that made Margaret's stomach tighten with an unease she couldn't explain. Later that week, she mentioned it to her coffee club friend, Eleanor. "He's been so attentive lately. Yesterday, I found him standing right outside my door when I opened it to get the newspaper. Said he was checking the smoke detectors in the hallway." Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Margaret, that's probably new building regulations or something. You know how these management companies are with their safety checks these days?" But the odd encounters continued. Margaret would catch glimpses of Mr. Harrison on her floor more frequently than ever before. Once she came home early from a canceled doctor's appointment and found him at the end of the hallway quickly putting something in his pocket when he saw her. "Checking for loose floorboards," he explained, though Margaret couldn't see any tools with him. The most unsettling incident happened on a Tuesday evening. Margaret had forgotten her reading glasses at the community center and had to go back. When she returned to the building an hour later than expected, she saw Mr. Harrison coming out of the stairwell on her floor. His master key ring was in his hand, and when he saw her, his face flushed red. "Oh, Mrs. Mitchell, I thought you were out for the evening. I was just going to check your radiator. Some of the other tenants mentioned hearing clanging noises." Margaret lived at the end of the hall. There were no other tenants past her apartment to hear anything. "My radiator is working fine," she said carefully, walking past him to her door. She could feel his eyes on her back as she unlocked her apartment and stepped inside. That night, she double-checked her lock and for the first time in 35 years, pushed a chair against the door before going to bed. Margaret sat at her kitchen table the next morning, staring at the chair she'd pushed against the door. In the bright morning sunlight streaming through her lace curtains, it looked ridiculous, paranoid even. She was a 73-year-old woman who'd lived through real hardships, real dangers. Now she was barricading her door because the building manager was being friendly? "Get a grip, Margaret," she told herself, moving the chair back to its proper place at the table. She decided to test herself to prove she was being silly. When she encountered Mr. Harrison in the lobby that afternoon, she forced herself to smile warmly at him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. Beautiful day, isn't it?" He seemed genuinely pleased by her friendliness. "It certainly is, Mrs. Mitchell. You know, I was just thinking about you. The grocery delivery truck is coming tomorrow. Would you like me to make sure they help you with your bags? See? Just a helpful building manager looking out for elderly tenants." Margaret felt ashamed of her suspicions. This was the same man who'd fixed her leaky faucet last winter without charging the usual maintenance fee. The same man who'd held the elevator for her countless times when she was moving slowly due to her arthritis. At Sunday dinner, she even mentioned her foolishness to her daughter Linda, though she downplayed it significantly. "I think I'm getting paranoid in my old age," Margaret laughed, passing the mashed potatoes to her grandson. "Poor Mr. Harrison has been checking on me more often, and I actually started wondering if something was wrong. Can you imagine?" Linda reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, you're the one who taught us to see the good in people. Remember when I was convinced my third-grade teacher hated me and you made me bring her cookies every week until I realized she was just strict because she cared? Besides, Uncle Robert added, helping himself to another slice of pot roast, Harrison's been managing this building for what, 15 years? If he was going to cause problems, don't you think he would have done it by now? Everyone at the table nodded in agreement. Margaret felt the warm reassurance of her family washing over her. Of course they were right. She was letting her imagination run wild, probably from watching too many of those crime shows with Eleanor during their coffee mornings. The next day, she made a decision. She would apologize to Mr. Harrison for being cold toward him, not with words that might embarrass them both, but with actions. She spent the morning baking his favorite banana bread, the recipe she'd perfected after he'd mentioned years ago that it reminded him of his grandmother's. She wrapped the still warm loaf in a cheerful tea towel and made her way down to his office on the first floor. The door was slightly open, and she could hear him on the phone. No, the old lady doesn't suspect anything," he was saying. Margaret froze, her hand raised to knock. But then he continued. "The surprise party for Mrs. Patterson's 80th birthday is going to be perfect. Mrs. Mitchell doesn't suspect anything, so she won't accidentally spoil the surprise." Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely that she had to lean against the wall for a moment. Of course. Mrs. Patterson's birthday was next week, and the building always did something special for milestone birthdays. She knocked gently and entered with a bright smile. "Mr. Harrison, I brought you some banana bread. Just wanted to thank you for all your help lately." His face lit up with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Mitchell, you didn't have to do this. You know I'm just doing my job, making sure all our residents are safe and comfortable." He accepted the bread gratefully and even offered her a cup of coffee, which she politely declined. As she walked back to the elevator, Margaret felt lighter than she had in weeks. Her instincts had been completely wrong. She was just a silly old woman letting her imagination run away with her. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in a week, no chair against the door, no worries in her mind. She even left her door unlocked while she went down the hall to return a borrowed cup of sugar to Mrs. Chen, something she'd been too paranoid to do for the past few days. She was so busy scolding herself for her unfounded suspicions that she never noticed the subtle scratches around her lock that hadn't been there before. She never saw the tiny camera that had been installed in the hallway smoke detector, pointed directly at her door. And she certainly didn't know that while she was returning that sugar to Mrs. Chen, someone was inside her apartment, carefully photographing every document in her filing cabinet. Sometimes our first instincts are our best protection, but Margaret had spent a lifetime choosing trust over suspicion, and she wasn't about to change now. She would regret that kindness very soon. It was a rainy Thursday morning, 2 weeks after she'd given Mr. Harrison the banana bread, when Margaret decided to tackle her closet organization. The rain drumming against her windows made it a perfect day for indoor projects. She'd been meaning to reorganize her important papers anyway, especially since tax season was approaching. She pulled out the old filing box from the top shelf of her bedroom closet, the one her late husband had bought at an office supply store, closing sale 40 years ago. The faded green metal was dented in places, but it had faithfully held their most important documents through moves, births, deaths, and everything in between. But the moment she opened it, Margaret knew something was wrong. Her lease agreement, which should have been in the front folder marked apartment, was shoved sideways into the middle section. The pages were out of order, page 3 before page 1, page 2, folded incorrectly. Margaret was meticulous about her filing system. She had to be, raising 4 children alone. Organization had been survival. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the lease folder completely. Behind it, where her social security card and birth certificate should have been neatly filed, papers were crammed in haphazardly. Someone had been through her documents. Someone who didn't know her system, who hadn't cared enough to put things back properly. Then she saw it. A document she'd never seen before, printed on official-looking letterhead from Hamilton Property Management. Her eyes scanned the text, her heart beginning to race. Voluntary relocation agreement. Margaret Mitchell, tenant of Unit 4B, agrees to vacate the premises by month's end in exchange for relocation assistance. Her signature was at the bottom, but Margaret knew she'd never signed this. The signature was close, very close, but the M in Mitchell was wrong. She'd been writing her name the same way for 70 years, with a distinctive curl at the end of the M that her mother had taught her. This M was too straight, too harsh. Margaret sank onto her bed, the paper shaking in her hands. She forced herself to keep looking through the box. More documents she didn't recognize, bank statements from her account that she hadn't opened, all recent, all showing large withdrawals she hadn't made. They were dated from the past month, but she religiously picked up her statements from the bank in person every month, and these weren't those statements. A letter from something called Sunshine Developments, LLC, thanking her for her cooperation in the upcoming renovation project and promising that her transition to assisted living would be smooth. Assisted living. The words made her stomach turn. Margaret's mind raced as she laid out all the foreign documents on her bedspread. There were 7 in total. Each one painted a picture of an elderly woman who was preparing to leave her home, who had agreed to move to a nursing facility, who was cooperating with some kind of building sale. But she had done none of these things. She had signed none of these papers. With shaking fingers, she reached for her phone and called her daughter Linda. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound upset." "Linda, I need you to come over. Bring Robert if he's available. Something's happening and I don't understand it." "Mom, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" Margaret looked at the papers spread across her bed, each one a piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. "I found documents in my filing box, documents with my signature that I never signed. Someone's been in my apartment, Linda. Someone's been in my private papers." There was a pause on the other end. "Mom, are you sure? Maybe you forgot." "Linda Marie Mitchell." Margaret's voice was firm now, the same tone she'd used when her children were young and she needed them to listen. "I may be 73, but I am not senile. I know what I have and haven't signed. Someone has forged my signature on legal documents, multiple documents." "We're on our way," Linda said, her voice now tight with concern. While waiting for her children, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She went to the kitchen, stood on a step stool, and reached behind the ancient flour canister on top of the refrigerator. Her fingers found the small notebook she'd hidden there, the one where she'd been keeping a record of every strange thing that had happened. She'd started it 3 weeks ago, feeling silly but compelled. Now, as she read through her notes about Mr. Harrison's strange behavior, the stuck lock, his presence on her floor at odd times, the pieces began forming a picture she didn't want to see. She added today's discovery to the notebook, her usually neat handwriting shaky but determined. Then she photographed each forged document with her phone, the one her grandson had taught her to use last Christmas. "Always have backup, Grandma," he'd said. "Always have proof." Margaret looked around her apartment, at the walls that held decades of memories, at the pictures of her late husband, at the Afghan her mother had made draped over the couch. Someone was trying to take this from her. Someone was trying to steal her home, her life, her independence. But they had underestimated Margaret Mitchell. She walked to her front door and turned the deadbolt she rarely used. Then she went to her bedroom, pulled out the emergency credit card her children had insisted she get, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would buy a new lock for her door, and a camera of her own. The evidence was clear now. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't imagining things. Someone was coming for everything she had. Margaret's children arrived within the hour, Linda still in her work clothes and Robert carrying his briefcase, having left an important meeting when he heard the urgency in his sister's voice. They sat around Margaret's kitchen table, the forged documents spread between them like evidence in a crime scene, which Margaret was beginning to realize they were. "We need to confront Harrison immediately," Robert said, his face red with anger. "This is fraud. This is criminal." "Wait," Linda said, studying the documents more carefully. "Look at these dates. They're all from the past month, but they reference agreements and conversations going back 3 months. This isn't just forgery. This is a planned operation." Margaret stood up, her decision made. "I'm going to talk to him, right now." "Mom, no." Linda reached for her arm. "We should call the police." "With what proof? Documents that have my signature on them. Even if it's forged, it looks real enough. They'll think I'm a confused old woman who forgot what she signed." Margaret's voice was steel. "No, I need him to admit it. I need to know why." Before her children could stop her, Margaret was out the door and heading to the elevator. Linda and Robert scrambled after her, catching up as the elevator descended. The ride down felt eternal, each floor marking another degree of Margaret's growing anger. They found Mr. Harrison in his office, feet up on his desk, talking on his cell phone. When he saw them, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a kind of resigned annoyance. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, then hung up. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you, and with family, I see." Margaret placed the forged documents on his desk with deliberate calm. "Explain these." Harrison glanced at the papers, then leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he maintained his facade of confusion. "These appear to be your relocation documents. Is there a problem with them?" "The problem," Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet, "is that I never signed them." Harrison sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this is hard. At your age, memory can be—" "Don't." Robert stepped forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Don't you dare try to gaslight my mother. We know these are forged." Something shifted in Harrison's face then. The mask of the helpful building manager slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He stood up slowly, walking to his office door and closing it with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous. "Fine," he said, turning back to face them. "You want the truth? The truth is that this building is sitting on a gold mine, and your mother's rent-controlled apartment is costing everyone money. Do you have any idea what this property could be worth without her here?" Linda gasped. "You're trying to force her out?" Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Force? No. I'm facilitating a transition that needs to happen. Your mother is 73 years old. She belongs in a care facility, not cluttering up valuable real estate." "Cluttering?" Margaret's voice shook with rage. "I've paid rent here for 35 years, never missed a payment." "Exactly." Harrison slammed his hand on the desk. 35 years of below-market rent. Do you know what a 2-bedroom in this building should cost? $3,000 a month minimum. Your mother pays $800. That's $2,200 a month this building loses because of her. He pulled out his phone, showing them photos of luxury apartments. "Sunshine Developments is offering to buy this building for $40 million. They'll convert it to luxury condos. But they won't buy it with rent-controlled tenants. Your mother and 3 others are the only things standing in the way." "The 3 others," Margaret said slowly. "Mrs. Garcia, who moved to a nursing home 6 months ago. Mr. Leopold, who supposedly went to live with his son. Mrs. Washington, who had that sudden diagnosis of dementia." Harrison's smile was predatory. "All very peaceful transitions. Families who understood that their elderly relatives needed more care than they could provide." "You forced them out," Robert said, understanding dawning on his face. "I helped them make the right decision, just like I'm helping your mother. These documents, they're just the beginning. You see, I have a social worker friend who's very concerned about Mrs. Mitchell living alone, and a doctor who's worried about her mental capacity, strange behavior, paranoia, forgetting things she's signed." He picked up one of the forged documents. "Your family already agreed to the transition, see? Your signatures are right here, giving me power of attorney to handle your mother's affairs." Linda grabbed the paper, staring at what looked like her signature. And Robert's. You forged our signatures too? Prove it, Harrison said simply. I have witnesses who saw you sign. I have a lawyer who filed the papers. I have a paper trail going back months showing your mother's declining capacity. Who do you think they'll believe? A confused elderly woman and her hysterical children? Or a concerned building manager with documented evidence? Margaret felt the room spinning. This was bigger than just forgery. This was a conspiracy, a web designed to trap her and steal everything. The development company, she said quietly. How much are they paying you? Harrison's grin widened. $500,000 cash under the table. All I have to do is deliver an empty building. Your mother is apartment 4B. Just one more letter in the alphabet of my success. You're insane if you think we'll let this happen, Robert said, pulling out his phone. I'm calling the police right now. Go ahead, Harrison said, returning to his desk chair. Tell them your confused mother found some documents she doesn't remember signing. Tell them the mean building manager is trying to help transition her to appropriate care. See how that goes. He looked directly at Margaret then, his eyes cold and dismissive. You should have taken the easy way, Mrs. Mitchell. Signed the papers when I first put them in front of you 3 weeks ago. You probably don't even remember that, do you? How I came to your apartment with coffee and cookies, and you signed everything while we chatted about your grandchildren. That never happened, Margaret said. No, I have security footage that says otherwise. Amazing what technology can do these days. A little editing, a little creative timestamp adjustment. He gestured to the camera in the corner of his office. That camera's been broken for months, of course, but the ones in the hallway work just fine. They show me visiting you multiple times, always being welcomed in. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. He'd planned everything. Every conversation, every interaction, all of it designed to build a case that she was incompetent, that she needed care, that her family had agreed to move her. Why? She asked simply. How can you do this to people who trusted you? Harrison stood up, straightening his tie. Because you're old, Mrs. Mitchell. You're taking up space that could be used by people who matter, people with money, people with futures. You had your time. Now it's time to move aside. He opened his office door, a clear dismissal. You have 2 weeks. Either you go quietly to the nice nursing home I've selected, or things get unpleasant. The choice is yours. As they walked out, Margaret heard him make one final comment. Oh, and don't bother changing your locks. I have master keys and legal authority to enter any apartment for safety checks. Have a nice day. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands, Robert's laptop open in front of her. Her son had insisted on staying over, now asleep on the couch. But Margaret's mind was racing too fast for rest. She started with simple Google searches. Sunshine Developments LLC. The company had a slick website full of gleaming towers and promises of urban renewal and luxury living solutions. But when she dug deeper, clicking through page after page of search results, she found something interesting. 3 other buildings in the city had been bought by Sunshine Developments in the past 2 years, all former rent-controlled properties, all mysteriously emptied of long-term tenants just before the sales. Her fingers weren't as fast on the keyboard as her grandchildren's, but Margaret was methodical. She found an old news article about one building in Queens. Tenants vacate aging building, ahead of renovation. The article mentioned several elderly residents who had chosen to relocate to assisted living facilities. One name caught her eye, Mrs. Ruby Patterson, 78, quoted as saying she was happy to be moving somewhere with better care. Margaret knew Ruby Patterson. They'd met at a city housing advocacy meeting 5 years ago. Ruby was sharp as a tack and had sworn she'd die in her apartment before leaving it. Margaret found Ruby's daughter's Facebook page. It took her an hour to figure out how to send a private message, but she managed it. This is Margaret Mitchell. I knew your mother, Ruby. Can we talk about her move from the Riverside building? While waiting for a response, she kept searching. Harrison's name didn't appear in any of the articles, but there was another name that kept coming up: Derek Walsh, a relocation specialist who helped facilitate the transitions. She found his LinkedIn profile. His job history showed he'd worked for 3 different property management companies, each one coincidentally managing buildings that Sunshine Developments later purchased. Her phone buzzed. Ruby's daughter had responded, "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been wanting to talk to someone about this for 2 years. Can you call me?" The conversation that followed made Margaret's blood run cold. Mom never wanted to leave, Ruby's daughter, Patricia, said through tears, but they had documents saying she'd agreed. They had a social worker who testified that Mom was showing signs of dementia. They even had video of her acting confused and disoriented. But Mrs. Mitchell, my mother, didn't have dementia. She was drugged. Drugged? We could never prove it. But the day that video was taken, Mom said the building manager had brought her tea, special tea for her arthritis. She couldn't remember anything clearly after drinking it. Within a week, she was in a nursing home. She died 6 months later. The doctors said it was failure to thrive. I say she died of a broken heart. Margaret wrote down every detail. After the call, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She made another cup of tea, then thought better of it and poured it down the sink. By dawn, she had compiled a list of 12 buildings, 47 displaced elderly tenants, and a pattern that was undeniable. It was always the same: friendly building manager, forged documents, a compliant social worker, a quick transition to a nursing home, and then a lucrative building sale. The amounts were staggering. Sunshine Developments had spent over $300 million on building acquisitions in the past 3 years. Robert woke up to find his mother surrounded by printed pages, her notebook filled with names, dates, and connections. "Mom, what is all this?" "It's not just about me," Margaret said. "This is a whole operation. Harrison isn't working alone. There's the social worker, Dr. Patricia Hem. She's signed off on 7 competency evaluations in the past 2 years, all for elderly tenants in buildings that Sunshine later bought. There's a lawyer, James Rothstein, who processes all the paperwork. There's Derek Walsh, who coordinates the transitions, and there's someone at Sunshine Developments orchestrating everything." Robert picked up one of the pages, his lawyer's mind immediately seeing the implications. "This is racketeering. This is a federal crime. But we need proof," Margaret said. "Real proof, not just patterns and suspicions." Linda arrived with breakfast and Margaret's grandson, Jamie, who was studying journalism at Columbia. When Jamie heard the full story, his eyes lit up with the fire of a reporter sensing a massive story. "Grandma, this is huge. This is Pulitzer-level huge. We need to document everything. We need to find the other families." They spent the day reaching out to families of displaced tenants. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. Mrs. Garcia's son revealed that his mother had been perfectly healthy until she drank tea with Harrison and suddenly seemed disoriented. Mr. Leopold's daughter said her father had called her crying the night before he was moved, saying people were forcing him to leave, but she dismissed it as paranoia. Mrs. Washington's grandson was the most revealing. "I'm a tech guy," he said when they reached him. "I analyzed the video they showed of my grandmother acting confused. It was edited, spliced together from different days. I could prove it, but by then she was already in the nursing home, and the judge said the technical evidence was inconclusive." But the biggest breakthrough came when Margaret remembered something. "The package," she said suddenly. "Harrison mentioned witnesses who saw my children sign the papers, but you never signed anything." "So who are these witnesses?" Linda asked. Jamie was already on his laptop. If they filed legal documents, the witnesses would have to be listed. He accessed public records, his journalism training paying off. "Here, the witnesses to your supposed signatures are interesting. One is Patricia Hem, the social worker. Another is James Rothstein, the lawyer. And the third is Maria Santos, Sunshine Development's Director of Acquisitions." "They're all in on it together," Robert said. "This is a conspiracy to defraud elderly tenants of their homes." Margaret looked at the wall of evidence they'd assembled. 47 elderly people forced from their homes. At least 3 who had died within a year of being moved. Hundreds of millions in profits, and she was supposed to be number 48. Harrison said, "I have 2 weeks," Margaret said quietly. "But I don't think we have that long. Ruby's daughter said things moved fast once they decided to force her mother out. The drugging, if that's what it was, happened within days of Ruby refusing to leave." "Then we need to act fast," Jamie said. "Grandma, we're going to expose everything. But first, we need to protect you, and we need to find the smoking gun that proves this is all connected." Margaret thought about the 47 faces she'd seen in photographs that day. Elderly people who'd worked their whole lives, who'd paid their rent, who'd believed they were safe in their homes. She thought about Ruby Patterson dying in a nursing home she never wanted to enter. "We're going to stop them," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "Not just for me, for all of them." She didn't know that Harrison was already making his next move, or that her tea that morning, delivered by a concerned neighbor while Robert was in the shower, had contained something that would make her seem very confused indeed when the social worker arrived for a routine wellness check that afternoon. The social worker left at 4:30 that afternoon, her clipboard full of notes about Margaret's concerning behavior during the wellness check. Margaret had struggled to focus, her words slurring slightly, her hands trembling as she tried to pour tea. The woman's sympathetic smile had been like salt in a wound. "Just routine, Mrs. Mitchell, but I am worried about you living alone. We'll talk more soon." After Robert walked the social worker out, suspicious but unable to prove anything wrong with a routine visit, Margaret locked herself in her bedroom. The drug, whatever it had been, was wearing off, leaving her with a crushing clarity about what had just happened. They'd made her look incompetent, in front of witnesses, with Robert right there, unable to do anything about it. She sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed she'd shared with Thomas for 28 years before cancer took him. Her fingers traced the worn pattern on the quilt her mother had made for their wedding. 73 years of life, and it all came down to this moment sitting here, helpless while strangers conspired to steal everything she'd built. The photographs on her dresser seemed to mock her with their frozen happiness. Thomas in his army uniform, young and handsome, promising to love her forever. Their wedding photo, Margaret in a simple dress she'd sewn herself because they couldn't afford a real wedding gown. Linda's first birthday, chocolate cake smeared across her laughing face. Robert taking his first steps right here in this apartment. Thomas's proud hands ready to catch him if he fell. Margaret picked up the photo from Robert's college graduation. She'd worked 3 jobs to help pay for his education. Her hands had been so swollen from arthritis that day, but she'd hidden them in gloves, not wanting to diminish his moment with her pain. She'd been so proud. They'd made it. They'd survived poverty, widowhood, everything life threw at them. For what? To be discarded like garbage when the neighborhood became too valuable for poor people? The tears came then, fierce and unstoppable. Not gentle elderly tears, but raw, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. She pressed her face into Thomas's pillow, the one she still kept on his side of the bed, though his scent had long since faded. "I'm so tired, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm so tired of fighting." She thought about Ruby Patterson, drugged and confused, dying in a nursing home while strangers lived in her apartment. Thought about Mr. Leopold, whose daughter hadn't believed him when he said he was being forced out. Thought about all the others whose names she'd written down, each one a life story ended with bureaucratic violence. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street 4 floors below. The same street where she'd taught Linda to ride a bike, where Robert had played stickball with the neighborhood kids, where she'd walked with Thomas on summer evenings, planning their future, never imagining it would end like this. Her reflection in the window showed an old woman she barely recognized. When had her shoulders become so stooped? When had her face developed so many lines? She'd been so busy living, so busy surviving, she hadn't noticed herself aging. But Harrison had noticed. He'd seen an easy target, a disposable obstacle to profit. The shoebox was under the bed, wrapped in tissue paper. Margaret pulled it out with shaking hands. Inside were her most precious things, not valuable to anyone but her. Thomas's watch, stopped at 3:47, the moment he died, the hospital bracelet from Linda's birth, a Mother's Day card Robert had made in kindergarten, crayon hearts covering construction paper, baby teeth, hospital bracelets, report cards, love letters Thomas had written during his army service. She spread them on the bed, each item a talisman against despair, but they felt hollow now. What good were memories when the place that housed them was being stolen? This apartment wasn't just walls and floors. It was where Thomas had proposed, getting down on one knee right by the kitchen table, where she'd labored for 13 hours with Linda because they couldn't afford the hospital until the last minute, where Robert had recovered from pneumonia, where Susan had announced her engagement, where Michael had taken his first steps. The hallway floorboards creaked in that specific way they did outside Mrs. Chen's apartment. Margaret thought about her neighbors, Mrs. Chen with her morning Tai Chi, the young couple in 4F with their new baby, the artist in 4C who sometimes played violin late at night. Did they know what was happening? Would they care? Or would they be relieved to see the old woman go, making room for someone who could pay market rate? Margaret found herself in the kitchen, standing at the stove where she'd cooked thousands of meals. Her hands moved automatically, pulling out the ingredients for soup, Thomas's favorite when he was sick. But halfway through chopping an onion, she stopped. Who was she cooking for? Who would eat her soup when she was locked away in some nursing home, drugged into compliance? The cutting board and knife clattered into the sink. Margaret slumped into a kitchen chair, her grandmother's chair with the embroidered cushion. 4 generations of women had sat in this chair. Her grandmother, her mother, herself, and Linda. Sarah was supposed to be the 5th, supposed to inherit not just furniture, but the stories, the recipes, the traditions that came with it. "I'm sorry, Mama," Margaret whispered to her mother's memory. "I tried to be strong like you, but I'm not. I'm just a scared old woman, and I don't know how to fight people like this." Her mother had survived the Depression, raised 6 children, buried 2 husbands, and never once gave up. She died at 91, sharp until the end, in her own bed, in her own home. She'd earned that dignity. Margaret had thought she'd earned it too. The phone rang. Linda checking in. Margaret couldn't answer. She couldn't. Pretend to be strong right now. The machine picked up. "Mom, it's me. Jamie found something important about the building sale. Call me back. And Mom, we're going to fix this, I promise. You're not alone." Not alone. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of 40 years, Margaret had never felt more isolated. They could drug her. They could forge documents. They could make her look crazy. They had all the power, and she was just an old woman with arthritis and memories. Outside, she heard Mr. Harrison's voice in the hallway, laughing with someone. The sound was like acid on her wounds. He was probably planning his vacation with the money he'd make from destroying her life. Margaret looked at the knife in the sink, then at her wrists, thin and marked with age spots. For just a moment, one terrible moment, she understood why some of the others had died so quickly after being moved. When you tear a plant from its soil, its roots damaged beyond repair, sometimes it just gives up. But then she saw it, stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Sarah's drawing from last week, a crayon picture of the 2 of them making pie. Me and Grandma written in careful first-grade letters. Best friends forever. Margaret stood up slowly, her joints protesting. She picked up the phone and dialed Linda's number. She might be 73 years old. She might be tired. She might be heartbroken. But she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Not when Sarah still needed to learn how to make that pie. Not when 47 other families deserved justice. Not when Harrison was in the hallway laughing at his victory. Margaret Mitchell had been knocked down before, but Thomas always said she was too stubborn to stay down. Time to prove him right one more time. The morning after her breakdown, Margaret woke up different. Not stronger exactly, but crystallized, like pressure and heat had transformed her fear into something harder, sharper. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of her building waking up. Mrs. Chen's door opening for her morning paper, the young couple's baby crying, the radiator's gentle clanking that had been her winter lullaby for 35 years. These sounds wouldn't be stolen from her, not without a fight that would make Harrison regret the day he'd chosen Margaret Mitchell as his victim. She got up and did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out Thomas's old army footlocker from the closet, the one he'd brought back from Korea. Inside, underneath his uniform and medals, was a small leather journal. Thomas had taught her something during their lean years, when creditors would call and landlords would threaten. "Document everything, Maggie," he'd said. "Paper trails protect poor people." Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a fresh notebook and began writing. Not the shaky, emotional notes from yesterday, but a precise timeline. Every interaction with Harrison, every strange occurrence, every date, time, and witness. She wrote for 2 hours, filling page after page with her careful script. Linda arrived at 9 with Jamie and Robert. They found their mother transformed. Gone was the shaken, elderly woman from yesterday. In her place sat the woman who'd raised 4 children alone, who'd fought insurance companies for Thomas's care, who'd once faced down a slumlord trying to evict them illegally. "Jamie," Margaret said without preamble, "you found something about the building sale." "Grandma, you're not going to believe this. Sunshine Developments doesn't actually have the money for the purchase yet. They're dependent on a bank loan that requires the building to be empty. If even one rent-controlled tenant remains, the loan falls through. The deadline is in 3 weeks." "That's why Harrison is moving so fast," Robert added. "He needs you out in 2 weeks to give them buffer time for the paperwork." Margaret nodded, processing this information like a general planning a battle. "And the other tenants they forced out? Have we reached all the families?" Linda pulled out a folder. 32 families have agreed to talk. 15 are willing to go on record. 6 have evidence of forgery or coercion. "It's not enough," Margaret said. "Harrison has that social worker, the lawyer, fake witnesses. We need something undeniable, something that proves the whole conspiracy." She stood up, pacing to the window. "In every crime, the criminals make mistakes. They get comfortable. They get sloppy. Harrison has done this so many times. He's arrogant. That's his weakness." She turned back to her family. "I was drugged yesterday. During that wellness check, I could barely speak clearly. Robert, you saw it." Robert's face darkened. "I knew something was wrong. You seemed so disoriented." "The tea," Margaret said. "Someone delivered tea yesterday morning, a concerned neighbor. But here's the thing. I've lived here for 35 years. I know every neighbor. The woman who brought that tea? I've never seen her before. She said she was from 4D, but 4D has been empty for 3 months." Jamie was already taking notes. "Could you describe her?" "Better than that," Margaret said with a small smile. "Mrs. Chen has a Ring doorbell. She records everything in the hallway. She's paranoid about package thieves. We can see exactly who this woman was." Within an hour, they had the footage. The woman who'd delivered the tea was Patricia Hem, the social worker. The same woman who'd conducted the wellness check hours later, documenting Margaret's impaired state. "This is it," Robert said excitedly. "This proves they drugged you." "No," Margaret said. "It proves she brought me tea. We need more. We need them to admit what they're doing." She sat back down, her fingers drumming on the table, a gesture her children recognized from their childhood when she was solving a problem. "Harrison thinks he's won. He's confident. Confident people talk. They brag. They let their guard down." She looked at Jamie. You said you're studying journalism. Can you get recording equipment? Good recording equipment? Grandma, what are you planning? Margaret's smile was the one Thomas used to call her battle smile, the one she wore when creditors called or when teachers underestimated her children. Harrison's going to make me an offer. He's going to come here, to my home, thinking I'm broken, thinking I'm scared. He's going to try to convince me to leave voluntarily to avoid the embarrassment of being forcibly removed. And when he does, he's going to talk. Men like Harrison always need to explain how clever they are, especially to the people they're destroying. He's going to want me to know I've been beaten by someone superior. Linda looked worried. Mom, that's dangerous. What if he drugs you again? Then you'll be hiding in the bedroom with the recording equipment, Margaret said simply. All of you. Mrs. Chen will be watching the hallway. The young couple in 4F, the husband is a paralegal. I helped them when they were behind on rent last year. They'll help us. The artist in 4C, her brother is a civil rights lawyer. She stood up again, this time with purpose. Harrison thinks I'm alone. He thinks I'm just another disposable old woman with no one to protect her. But this building is full of people I've helped over the years. People whose babies I've watched, whose groceries I've carried, whose tears I've dried. It's time to call in those debts. Robert shook his head in amazement. When did you become a mastermind? Margaret looked at Thomas's photo on the wall. Your father always said I should have been a general. I just never had a war worth fighting. She turned back to her children. Now I do. Harrison wants to erase 47 elderly people like we never existed. But we did exist. We do exist. And I'll be damned if I let him win. She picked up her phone and started dialing. Mrs. Chen, it's Margaret. I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over and bring your son, the one who works for the district attorney's office? One by one, Margaret began assembling her army. The building super who'd always respected her, the mailman who'd delivered her letters for 15 years, the grocery store owner who'd extended credit during tough times, the priest from St. Anthony's who'd presided over Thomas's funeral, the councilwoman whose first campaign Margaret had volunteered for 20 years ago. By evening, her small apartment was full of people, all listening as Margaret laid out what was happening. The room buzzed with outrage, offers of help, and suggestions for action. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about their community, their neighborhood, their right to exist in a city increasingly hostile to anyone without money. As the meeting broke up, Margaret stood by her door, shaking hands, accepting hugs, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Harrison had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed she was alone. But nobody who's lived somewhere for 35 years, who's been kind to their neighbors, who's built a life of small gestures and daily love, is ever really alone. Jamie set up his recording equipment in strategic places around the apartment, hidden but effective. Robert consulted with his law partners about emergency injunctions. Linda reached out to advocacy groups for the elderly. And Margaret? Margaret sat at her kitchen table and wrote Harrison a note, her handwriting deliberately shaky. Mr. Harrison, I've been thinking about what you said. Perhaps we should discuss my options. Could you come by tomorrow at 2 p.m.? I'll be alone, and we can talk privately about my future. M. Mitchell. She sealed it in an envelope, her hands steady as stone. Tomorrow, Harrison would come to claim his victory. Instead, he would walk into his defeat. The mouse was about to trap the cat, and Harrison would never see it coming. Margaret Mitchell was done being anyone's victim. It was time to be the hero of her own story. Margaret spent the night before Harrison's visit preparing like a general before battle. She had Jamie test every piece of recording equipment 3 times. The tiny camera in the bookshelf between 2 photo albums, the microphone inside the silk flower arrangement on the coffee table, the backup recorder in the kitchen tucked behind the cookie jar. Every angle covered, every word would be captured. "Grandma, this is broadcast quality equipment," Jamie said, showing her how the devices worked. Whatever he says, we'll have it crystal clear." But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just recordings. She wanted witnesses, but hidden ones. The apartment next door, 4C, had been vacant for 2 weeks. Margaret had helped the landlord's mother years ago, and he'd given her a spare key for emergencies. She positioned Linda and Robert there, where they could hear everything through the thin walls and intervene if necessary. Mrs. Chen's son, David, from the DA's office, would be in Margaret's bedroom with Jamie, ready to witness everything firsthand. The young paralegal from 4F would be stationed in the stairwell, documenting everyone who entered and left the floor. Even the building's super, Carlos, who despised Harrison for treating him like dirt, would be in the basement, ready to shut off power to the security cameras at Margaret's signal, ensuring Harrison couldn't later claim the recordings were edited or false. Margaret had studied Harrison for the past day, really studied him. She'd called former tenants from his previous buildings, pretending to be a reporter. The pattern was clear. He loved to gloat. 3 different people described how he'd visited them before their removal, explaining exactly how he'd outsmarted them, how futile their resistance was. His ego was his weakness, and Margaret planned to exploit it. She prepared her apartment carefully. On the kitchen table, she placed the forged documents, annotated with shaky handwriting as if she'd been trying to understand them. She left a half-packed suitcase visible in the bedroom doorway, suggesting defeat. She even placed a brochure for the nursing home Harrison had selected on the coffee table, with sections seemingly highlighted in resignation. At 1:30, Margaret took a mild sedative, just enough to make her appear slightly foggy, vulnerable. Not enough to actually impair her judgment, but enough to make Harrison confident. She dressed in her oldest house dress, removed her usual lipstick, and deliberately messed her normally neat hair. She needed to look like a broken woman. At exactly 2 o'clock, Harrison knocked. Margaret let him wait 30 seconds before answering, shuffling to the door in her slippers. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice deliberately weak. "Thank you for coming." He entered with the confidence of a predator who knows the prey is cornered. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing an expensive suit, probably bought with his previous victim's money. His eyes scanned the apartment, noting the suitcase, the documents, the nursing home brochure. His smile was satisfied. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm glad you've come to your senses. This really is for the best." Margaret gestured to the couch, positioning herself so he'd sit directly in front of the hidden camera. "Would you like some tea?" "No," he said quickly, then caught himself. I'm fine. Let's just talk about your transition." Margaret sat across from him, letting her hands tremble slightly as she picked up the forged documents. "I don't understand these papers. My signature, I don't remember." Harrison leaned back, his confidence growing. "Memory problems are common at your age. That's why you need professional care. But the dates, I was at my granddaughter's recital that day. I have the program." "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison's voice took on a patronizing tone, "I'm trying to help you here. The development is happening whether you cooperate or not. Sunshine Developments has already paid me." He caught himself, but then shrugged. "Well, let's just say I have a significant financial interest in this transition happening smoothly." Margaret let tears form in her eyes, not entirely fake ones. 47 others. You did this to 47 others. Harrison actually laughed. 47? You've been doing research. I'm impressed. Actually, it's 53 if you count my work in Jersey. You'd be 54. A nice round number to retire on. $500,000, Margaret whispered. "That's what my home is worth to you? Your home?" Harrison stood, pacing now, his arrogance fully unleashed. "This isn't your home, it's a commodity, real estate. You're sitting on a gold mine and paying pennies for it. It's economically inefficient." "I've paid rent for 35 years. Below market rent. You're essentially stealing from the building's potential value. But don't worry, the nursing home is actually quite nice. Medicaid will cover most of it after we liquidate your assets." Margaret's head snapped up. Liquidate my assets. Harrison pulled out a document from his briefcase. Power of attorney. Your children already signed it, remember? Well, my versions of their signatures did. Once you're declared incompetent, which Dr. Hem will handle tomorrow, I control everything. Your bank accounts, your husband's pension, that little life insurance policy you've been paying on for 40 years. It all goes to covering your care costs. Amazing how expensive care can be. You're stealing everything, Margaret said, no longer pretending to be weak. I'm facilitating a transition. The fact that I profit from it is just good business. He returned to the couch, leaning forward. You want to know the beautiful part? It's all perfectly legal. Every document will stand up in court. Every evaluation is from a licensed professional. Every witness is reputable. Your family could spend years fighting this and never prove anything. The tea, Margaret said. You drugged me. Harrison's smile was cold. Prove it. The social worker brought you tea. You seemed impaired hours later. Could have been anything. Maybe you took too much of your medication. Elderly people get confused about their pills. He pulled out more papers. Sign these voluntarily, and you can take some belongings to the nursing home. Fight me, and you'll be removed by Adult Protective Services tomorrow with nothing but the clothes on your back. Your choice. Margaret looked at the papers, then at Harrison's smug face. You really think you've won, don't you? I know I've won. I've done this 53 times, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm very good at it. The Garcia family, Ruby Patterson, Mr. Leopold, Mrs. Washington, all of them. All of them, Harrison confirmed, and dozens more you haven't found. Do you know how many elderly people are sitting on rent-controlled apartments in this city? Thousands. And firms like Sunshine will pay millions to remove them. I'm providing a valuable service. You're destroying lives. I'm maximizing property values. It's not personal, Mrs. Mitchell. You're just in the way of progress. Margaret stood slowly. My husband fought in Korea. He came home with medals for bravery. He used to tell me that the bravest thing wasn't facing the enemy. It was knowing when to spring the trap. Harrison's confidence flickered. What? Margaret walked to her door and opened it. Now. The apartment suddenly filled with people. David Chen from the DA's office emerged from the bedroom. Linda and Robert came in from next door. Jamie appeared with his camera. Carlos, the super, entered with 2 uniformed police officers he'd been keeping downstairs. Harrison jumped to his feet, his face draining of color. What is this? This, said David Chen, pulling out his badge, is justice. We have you on tape admitting to 54 counts of fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and racketeering. That's federal, Mr. Harrison. That's FBI territory. Harrison lunged for the door, but Carlos blocked his way. Going somewhere, Jefe? You treated me like garbage for 15 years. This is what we call karma. As the police officers moved forward with handcuffs, Harrison turned to Margaret, his face twisted with rage. You set me up. You played me. Margaret stood tall, her 73 years of wisdom shining in her eyes. You thought I was weak because I'm old. You thought I was alone because I'm widowed. You thought I was stupid because I'm poor. You were wrong on all counts. The handcuffs clicked around Harrison's wrists. As they led him toward the door, Margaret had one more thing to say. 54 elderly people, Mr. Harrison. 54 lives you destroyed for money, but you forgot something important. We old people have something you don't. What's that? He snarled. Time to plan revenge, and the wisdom to execute it perfectly. As the police led Harrison away, his shouts echoing in the hallway, Margaret's apartment erupted in celebration. But she remained quiet, walking to her window to watch them put Harrison in the police car below. That's for you, Ruby, she whispered. For all of you. The war wasn't over. There was still Dr. Hem to catch, the lawyer Rothstein, and the executives at Sunshine Developments. But the biggest predator had been caged. Margaret Mitchell had won the first battle.